of Kentucky in the early 1930s, you couldn't have asked for a finer place to rest your head for the night than the Hatcher Hotel in Pikeville. Built by local businessman James Hatcher, the hotel was proudly fireproof and had a small museum in the reception area. Two things I always looked for when booking a place to stay. Hatcher's hotel was a bit of a strange one. He had his favourite sayings and quotes written all over the walls of the lobby, and the museum contained an odd mix of artifacts, including an iron lung, which was high-tech medical equipment at the time. Easily the most bizarre object on display, though, was Hatcher's coffin, which he had built years before his death. Ignoring for a moment the weirdness of introducing hotel guests to the box you're going to be buried in, there was something unique about this coffin. It was built to escape, with latches on the inside, which necessitated a specially made tool for sealing the box before placing it in its tomb. Hatcher's coffin was designed to prevent him from being buried alive. And who could blame him? Local historians tell the story of Hatcher's wife Octavia, who he'd married in 1889. After the couple's only son died shortly after birth in January 1891, Octavia entered a deep depression from which she would never recover. Her condition gradually worsened until she fell into a coma and died, being pronounced dead on the 2nd of May, 1891. In those days, embalming wasn't a common practice yet, and no refrigeration meant there was no morgues to keep bodies cool. So people were generally put in the ground as soon as possible after death to avoid the rather unpleasant reality of putrefaction. It was an unusually hot summer in Pikeville that year, so Octavia Hatcher was buried with even more haste than was usual. Then, a few days passed by and other townsfolk also began to show signs of severe sleepiness, lapsing into comas, just like Octavia. Today, there are numerous theories for what caused this illness, ranging from mosquitoes to tsetse flies to toxic gases escaping from a nearby mine. But at the time, Hatcher was simply worried by the similarities between the sleeping sickness and his wife's condition. So just to be on the safe side, he sought permission to dig up his wife's body, and he was met with a harrowing scene. The inner lining of the coffin had been torn, and Octavia's fingers were bloodied from scratching at the lid. Her face was allegedly twisted with fear, and there was no doubt she had died a horrible and prolonged death. Some fairly sizable question marks hang over the story of Octavia's premature burial, not least because there's no documented evidence to actually support it. But for many people, it provides a neat reason for why James Hatcher felt so compelled to build himself an escapable coffin. But many folk back then who didn't even have an undead wife to their name shared Hatcher's fear, being buried alive, known as tephobia. And it was quite common in the 19th century. Given the standard of medical science at the time, it's not hard to see why. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. I love cereal. Honestly, I'd eat it for dinner if I could. But everyone knows that cereal is full of sugar. But that doesn't stop our cereal cravings, does it? So, what if you could relive all the best cereals from your childhood, but without the calories? Well, you can, with Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon tastes exactly like the cereal you know and love. However, it's incredibly nutritious. To be precise, it contains 14 grams of protein, only 4 net grams of carbs, and is only 140 calories per servings. And the best bit? 0 grams of sugar. 0. Magic Spoon offers a variety of flavors, but don't worry if you can't decide, because you can try all of Magic Spoon's best-selling options in their variety pack. Magic Spoon is keto-friendly, low-carb, and caters for a number of intolerances because it's also gluten, grain, and soy-free. I genuinely can't believe how something so nutritious can taste that darn amazing. So, if you're ready to start enjoying cereal again without the guilt, you can click the link below to grab a variety pack and try it out. And be sure to use the promo code 42 at checkout to get $5 off any order. Or you can also head to magicspoon.com/42. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if for any reason you don't like it, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So click the link below or head to magicspoon.com/42 to save $5 by using the code 42. We tend to think of death as an instantaneous process. Now you see me, now you don't. But it can actually be quite drawn out, with different parts of the body shutting down in different stages. Your body can remain alive, for example, even after your brain is dead. Whilst there's also evidence to suggest that the brain keeps working after the heart has stopped. That makes it difficult enough to determine exactly when someone has died, but then there's also some medical conditions that make the doctor's job even harder. In January of 2018, a man in the Asturias region of Spain was pronounced dead by 3 different doctors. Then, just a few hours before his autopsy, he was heard snoring in the morgue. Doctors had already made marks on his body, ready for the post-mortem dissection. Once everyone had calmed down from, "Holy crap, we almost cut open a living human being," sober scientific reflection suggested the man may have had catalepsy. Symptoms of catalepsy include rigid limbs, total lack of responsiveness, and a slowing of bodily functions. Vital signs like breathing and heart rate can be so reduced that they're virtually impossible to detect, even by doctors in the 21st century. In 1915, Ezzie Dunbar, a woman in South Carolina suffering from catalepsy's cousin, epilepsy, was pronounced dead by a doctor after suffering a severe epileptic fit. She was buried the next day, but then dug back up a short while later after her sister, who was late for the funeral, begged to be allowed to say a final farewell to her body. But when they opened the coffin, Essie sat up smiling, apparently unaware of anything that had happened. But that's not the full story. The priest then suffered severe injuries after falling into the grave with shock, and Essie was labelled a zombie. But you can't have everything in life, can you? Now imagine what things must have been like before the invention of the stethoscope in 1816. Even without extreme epilepsy or conditions like catalepsy, there are many illnesses that can render signs of life undetectable to the naked eye, so it's easy to see how death may have been misdiagnosed in the past. Back then, the most scientific ways of determining whether someone was still living or not involved using feathers or mirrors to check for signs of breath. Tales of accidental burials go back as far as the 14th century. Upon opening the tomb of Middle Ages philosopher John Duns Scotus, witnesses found his body outside his coffin, with his hands badly damaged from trying to escape. Another famous story dates back to the 1600s in England, when a woman named Alice Blunden passed out after drinking a large draught of poppy seed tea. Of course, a large volume of poppy seeds contains enough morphine and codeine to knock out a giraffe. No, not really. I just said that for dramatic effect, but it probably would have left Alice heavily sedated. After applying the foolproof mirror test to confirm that Alice was indeed a goner, she was pronounced dead and promptly buried. 2 days later though, children playing near the gravesite, which was apparently a normal thing to do in the 17th century, heard noises and went to call their schoolmaster. After realising that Alice was still clearly alive down there, work began to exhume her. But since it took almost a day to do so, she was teetering on death by the time they reached her. Seeing what a bad state she was in, those responsible obviously decided to save themselves some time and simply chucked her back in the ground. It was clearly a tough time to be alive. Or dead, I guess. On this occasion, at least, a guard was left to make sure Alice didn't spring back to life again. Not much good it did her though. He ditched his post, and Alice was found dead the next morning after having tried to escape from her coffin once more. Stories like these, as well as countless urban legends and folk tales, fueled widespread taphophobia, peaking during the cholera epidemics of the 1800s. In 1895, British magazine Spectator declared that burning, drowning, even the most hideous mutilation under a railway train is as nothing compared with burial alive. Popular writers like Edgar Allan Poe fueled fears with stories like Premature Burial, in which the narrator, who is terrified of being buried alive, does everything possible to avoid the situation, but ends up waking up underground anyway. Sorry, I should have given you a spoiler alert there. You might want to find a different 17th century short story to read this evening. Even the more cultured and educated of society were bricking it. Legendary musician Frédéric Chopin insisted that his heart be cut out when he died to make sure he was truly dead. George Washington wanted his body watched over for 3 days before he was buried, whilst Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen and Swedish polymath Alfred Nobel both asked for their arteries to be cut open when they passed away. Just to be sure, Andersen also used to sleep with a sign that said, "I am not dead." To illustrate how common a concern this was, look no further than death houses, which were built to allow a buffer between death and burial. One example, the Apparent Death House in The Hague, the Netherlands, can still be visited today. Established in 1830, the building has a central room that was used to house the recently dead. There, they would be monitored by attendants who would periodically check for signs of breathing. The bodies were also surrounded by strings connected to bells in case the dead woke up and fancied playing a tune. Only if, after a few days, there was still no signs of life, would the now ripe corpses be committed to the ground for good. In Germany, at the turn of the 19th century, Leichenhauses, or waiting houses, became popular to store corpses until they began decomposing and were obviously dead. Some were scented with piles of flowers, whilst others allowed people to pay entry and wander amongst the decaying bodies. Which, now I think about it, is quite an improvement on some of the dates I've been on in my life. It didn't take long for inventors and entrepreneurs to come up with creative ways to avoid accidental burial. In 1752, Frenchman Antoine Louis created one of the more unpleasant jobs in history when he suggested giving the dead tobacco enemas to check if they were still alive. The technique, which apparently has no connection to the phrase to blow smoke up someone's arse, was already being used to resuscitate drowned victims, and remained a popular way of testing for death right into the 19th century. One French priest suggested replacing the tobacco smoke with a red-hot poker, but unsurprisingly, the idea never caught on, not even amongst the dead people. Amply illustrating why his country gave birth to the word sadist, it was yet another Frenchman who invented the Pons Mamelon, or nipple pincher, a pair of giant tweezers that were used to, well, I'm pretty sure you can work that one out for yourself. Of course, the French weren't the only ones to come up with clever but twisted ways of confirming mortality. Across the channel in England, some bright spark thought of writing the words "I am dead" in silver nitrate on a pane of glass, before hanging the glass above the dead body in a coffin. The writing would be revealed when the gases from the decomposing body reacted with the silver nitrate, indicating to the undertaker and anyone within 10 meters who had a sense of smell that the person was definitely dead. But these macabre contraptions did little to allay people's fears, and by far the most desirable post-bucket-kicking commodity were safety coffins. One common design element, as in the coffin displayed by James Hatcher in his hotel museum, was a latch on the inside of the coffin to allow the occupant to open it from within, which obviously only had practical use if the person was buried in a tomb and not under 6 feet of earth. Of course, this was the case for most people who wanted safety coffins, as poorer people, the type that get graves, not tombs, wouldn't have been able to afford safety coffins anyway. Another popular design option was to include some sort of window. The first known order for a safety coffin was from Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who died in 1792. His coffin had a window to allow light in, plus a tube for fresh air, and a series of locks that could be unlocked from the inside. To this day, if you visit the graveyard of Town Hill Road in New Haven, Vermont, you can find the grave of Timothy Clark Smith, a 19th century doctor who had a window inserted in a horizontal gravestone directly above where his head would have been situated when he was laid to rest. He was also buried with a breathing tube and a bell, and the tomb included a set of stairs that could be used to climb out. I'm fairly sure he's dead now. One coffin, designed by German Adolf Guttsmith, included a feeding tube. The inventor proved how effective it was by spending a few hours underground, during which time he ate a meal of soup, bratwurst, marzipan, sauerkraut, spätzle, beer, and a dessert. Because everyone knows that the most pressing concern when you've just been buried alive is to have a relaxing 4-course meal. By far the most popular device in safety coffins was some form of bell that allowed the person to ring it and notify those above ground that they were indeed still alive. This has spawned a range of misconceptions about phrases like dead ringer, graveyard shift, and saved by the bell, all of which are thought to have something to do with safety coffins used in the Victorian era. In fact, none of these figures of speech are connected with accidental burial at all. As far as we know, nobody has been saved by a safety coffin, but don't worry, they're still available if you need something to soothe your tephobia. In 1995, a patent was registered for a safety coffin that included an intercom system, an emergency alarm, a torch, breathing apparatus, and a heart monitor. Of course, you could just be buried with your phone instead, providing you can get signal 6 feet under. The fear of being buried alive is a lot less common these days, partly because of more advanced medical techniques and partly because of modern methods for corpse preservation. Arterial embalming, introduced in the late 19th century, involves replacing the blood in the human body with embalming fluid, and since that fluid is usually a mix of formaldehyde, methanol, and ethanol, there's little chance of you being alive afterwards anyway. That doesn't mean things still don't go wrong though. In 2018, Brazilian woman Rosângela Almeida dos Santos was buried after dying from septic shock following 2 heart attacks. 11 days later though, her family was alerted after a passerby heard noises coming from her concrete tomb. Her family broke the tomb open and took out the wooden coffin, but it was too late. Dos Santos had died. She had clearly been trying to fight her way out of her coffin, with damage to her hands and forehead, as well as blood around the inside of the casket. Even the nails used to keep the coffin closed had been loosened by her efforts. So, when it comes time for you to shuffle off this mortal coil, make sure you're put in the ground by someone you trust, and preferably someone who's not a beneficiary on your life insurance policy. Thanks for watching.